Hello and welcome to Hour of History. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week I have Josh Stern on the show. Josh is a PhD student at Temple University, where he studies U.S. foreign relations with Latin America, specifically in the 20th century, but we don't need to get into that because we have such a fantastic show about the migrant caravan that is making its way towards the United States and taking up most of the news cycle, especially in front of the election. This episode is brought to you by Printful. Printful is easy on-demand online printing, fulfillment, and shipping. Just go to hourofhistory.com/printful, Printful, to see all the various custom products you can choose from for you or your business. Mugs, sweatshirts, hats, swimwear, all that, and much, much more. Go to hourofhistory.com/printful now, and you can mock up any merch you have. You can make your own custom brand. Actually, it's a really good site to go to, hourofhistory.com/printful. This is another fantastic episode of Hour of History. Please do enjoy. Please think about these migrants who are making their long journey across the Americas. Thanks for listening. Remember to subscribe. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this is Hour of History, where it's our world, anytime, any place.
This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, any place. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week I'm here with Josh talking about a migrant caravan.
That's right. Thanks for having me back. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so first maybe we can talk a little bit of background on this sort of migration that's happening, and then, let's just take it from there. So what happened? What's happening?
So what's happening is a caravan, the one that's been in the news recently, of at one point got to about 7,000 people that started in Honduras in Central America, and with about, I think it was about 1,000 to 1,500 people they started. And it grew to about 7,000, and then once they got to Mexico, about 1,500 to 1,000 emigrated to Mexico successfully. So now they're living in Mexico, and the rest are on their way to the American border. There are no reports exactly about where they are going to cross, when they are going to get there. The only thing we know is that there are a lot of people, and that along the way there has been the overwhelming majority of people that have encountered this caravan in south of the border have been supportive for the most part. And we also know about the political side in the United States, the politicization of this event by Donald Trump and Twitter and others regarding this. Yeah, so that's what we know so far.
So it's kind of interesting seeing this high politicization coming up with the elections are on Tuesday, just around the corner, and it seems that immigration is becoming the big issue. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the history of the caravan and the history of Central America more broadly. But first, I just kind of want to stress the size of this thing and the distance of walking. So leaving from Honduras, San Pedro Sula, which kind of has this reputation as the most dangerous place in the world with this gang MS-13 that Trump learned about. And this caravan has been walking. They've made it to Mexico now. So they went through Guatemala, made it through Mexico. There were some images of them being confronted a little bit by the Mexican police. Mm-hmm. But this is a long walk they've undertaken. What do you think about this taking a walk as the sort of, and publicizing it? What are your thoughts on that?
As you know, with some of the books I see on your desk, you know about Gandhi, you know about previous walks, politically minded, politically conscious efforts of walking to a specific location for a specific symbology or motivation. It could be a material one. It could be simply a political one, a social one. But what it does is, I think personally that what's being lost in kind of the media in terms of this case are a few things. One is the act of walking. This does two things. One, it puts people, because people are watching, they understand just how arduous this walk actually is instead of just talking about it. They see people going through it, and the level of risk that people are taking just to get there, which adds to the kind of understanding of these people and empathizing with people from Central America. But also, we need to keep in mind that, again, that the walk itself is, in terms of an image, I mean, you've seen images of them, is incredibly, I don't know what the best word is, but it's awesome in the sense that,
in the 1920s sense
long.
Of the word.
Right, like the pictures are reminiscent of pictures of before and just kind of the awesomeness of it as an event. Like, this is an event. Like, there were previous caravans that have been going on for the last 10 years from Central America. I think the largest one before this was about 1,000 maybe or something like that. So this is like not a new event in terms of people in a caravan marching together, because it's safer to do that, for one thing, instead of going individually with coyotes and stuff like that. If you have a larger group, there's less risk. But also, it's kind of what makes it new is just the sheer size of it, I think, is something that's definitely new about it.
So let's take some perspectives. I know we share a lot of the same background as far as studying history, but for someone who's watching this in, say, Pennsylvania, and hopefully we can talk about this, especially with the horrific shooting that just happened in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. The murderer, the guy who carried out the act, had posted on social media that he was mad at HoH, which is a Jewish organization, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, who is responsible for helping these asylum seekers. So there was anger coming from someone in Pittsburgh. What would you say to someone who might be in the United States, in a northern, it could be a southern state, saying, why don't these people just stay in Honduras and get a job there? Like, how do you respond to someone who says something like that?
Well, I mean, that talk we went to, looking at HoH and looking at the history of anti-Semitism, I think the effort and the need to look at this historically is really important as historians, is one thing. Because if you just look at it on its face, meaning if you just look at the newsreels of it, specifically from maybe the right or left, either way, you get a condensed view and an easily digestible view of what this is, right? And a migrant, an individual, a refugee, these different terminologies are very complex. The individuals are very complex. They come from complex situations. But I would say to someone that's here that the need to understand the history of that region, not only the level of underdevelopment of that region, but also the United States actions in that region that have not directly, in terms of like everything is because of U.S. intervention in that region, but there's a long history of the connection between Central America and the United States that has led to its underdevelopment, which has then led to so many people seeking refuge where they have to leave, right? These are poor people where this decision is probably the biggest decision of their life, mm-hmm. right? Because they're so poor and desperate that this could lead to their deaths. It could lead to the rape of their children. It could lead to prosperity. It could lead to a new life. It could lead to them being deported back and be assassinated. It could lead to them just losing all of their money, mm-hmm. right, and being deported back. So there are many more negative things that could happen than positive things to them, but they still choose to make that trek, the majority of them, which says something in and of itself, I think. That's what I would say to people, is try to understand, and maybe we'll talk about it today, the history of it.
Yeah.
Which will allow us to really understand the level of violence, the level of instability, and the level of underdevelopment in terms of the economy of people there.
Yeah. And I think hopefully, we have enough time to sort of get into this and talk about the different terms of refugee and asylum seekers and so on. They're all different things, and migrant, immigrant. One thing that is central to this discussion and central to so many discussions that we're having now is the concept of nation. And when we talk about a nation like Honduras, where this is starting, I think a lot of people are tempted to begin understanding this nation in just a context, taking for granted that nations always existed. And going back to Honduras, you can go back as far as you want. Typically, I go back to the imperial period. And if we talk about, the first Europeans coming to Honduras, we're already talking about a breaking down of there's just one ethnic group in this region, and it's already a multicultural nation. So it kind of challenges the idea of nation. How far would you go back in talking about the history? How far do we need to go back to understand Honduras? Do we have to go all the way back to Columbus and the first encounters?
I mean, you could. You could do that. For one thing, one reason why you might is because of kind of the specificity of that region in terms of the level of indigenous culture and racial backgrounds there, in Guatemala especially, but also in other parts of Central America. Indigenous culture, much like in Mexico and other places, but indigenous culture in those regions was very diverse and has been a huge part of the struggle against colonial and imperialism in that region. So you could go back to that in terms of kind of colonial understandings of race with the Spanish and how they subjugated the indigenous peoples, just because a lot of the modern contemporary movements that are going on regarding environmental degradation and things like that in that region are based within the indigenous context, as opposed to other places, maybe in South America and in Central America.
And so when you're saying indigenous for Central Americans, are you talking what, Mayans, Aztecs in Mexico?
Mayans, Aztec, Nahua goes into parts of the Nahuatl culture go into Guatemala, but there's also other cultures through Central America.
And these are groups that were there and are at least attempting to survive through colonization. In a lot of cases, for the first empires, they would use these people in sort of commodity industries where they could take good in Honduras, timber was big for a while when they were still building boats out of that kind of thing, before the steel and things like that. And the indigenous would be used until they were not productive enough to pull out, or if they died, or if they escaped. So a lot of indigenous escape to areas that are not colonized. They die from disease, or they die from overwork, or the industry changes and it's not as beneficial to employ them. Okay, so we already have, this mix, but there's also a high level of mixture, right?
Sure. I mean, like you said, there's been immigration from Asia, from other places. You have immigration in Nicaragua. There's a large Jamaican population on the east coast of Nicaragua. You have different racial configurations. So there's that there. But I do think the history that is the most prominent based on this caravan, this particular political moment, starts in kind of the turn of the 20th century with the United States involvement. I had a student today talk about the caravan. Actually, I didn't bring it up. We were talking about King Leopold's Ghost, which is a book about the Congo, right around that same time as U.S. occupationism in Central America. And he brought up, we were talking about why would he pick the title of that book for that book? Like, why King Leopold's Ghost? What is the ghost? And he says the ghost could be a systemic answer where the systems of oppression continuously reappear in forms of contradictions and crisis, right? One could be this migrant caravan where it's a ghost of a past U.S. imperialism in that region that continuously comes up in different crises. And this crisis happens to be a migration crisis. In the 80s, it was a communist crisis. In the 50s and 60s, it was a crisis of needing to develop the region and how we're going to develop the region and who's going to be able to develop the region. In the 20s, it was a post-independence reality, and like, are these people capable of running the governments themselves? Do we need to be there for it? occupation style understanding. So these contradictions always pop up in terms of U.S. what they say they're trying to do in terms of humanitarian roles, right? Yeah. And then what they actually end up doing. And that never seems to really be solved, that this ghost keeps coming back.
Yeah, so it certainly sounds like there is this specter of the past lurking behind our actions. The U.S. does have a long history of intervention in Latin and Central America specifically, especially going back to 1823 is kind of that foundational Monroe Doctrine as Latin American nations are getting their independence and as Central America is becoming, in fact, the United Provinces of Central America. The U.S. kind of says, we'll be here. We're watching you. We've got an eye on you. And all the way up to the Roosevelt corollary in 1904, maybe we can pick it up there. Well, for what reasons was the United States moving into Central America? Why would the U.S. care about these people in Honduras?
Well, I've heard actually a couple of reasons. I'll stick with material first. So materially, there had been since the 1880s, with the English and the French as well, but also with the United States and global capital, the need to try to create a canal that you don't have to go all the way around the end of the world at the bottom of South America to go all the way up to the Pacific. It would cut down costs. It would be an incredible feat. It also adds to like the kind of technological age of the Industrial Revolution, showing the economic prowess of the Western European and kind of Anglo kind of understanding. And so that was the first bit. They wanted to do it through Nicaragua originally. But actually, I've read about Stephen Kinzer wrote a book, I can't remember the title of it, but it was a book on kind of U.S. interventionism from that period to 1880s all the way to the Iraq War. He talks about the new Nicaraguan president Zelaya at that time, who was trying to create this canal, but wanted to have more of an economic basis for the people of Central America for the profits of that canal. And there was a propaganda campaign that was orchestrated in New York and things like that, that kind of switched the idea of trying to move the canal to Panama instead of Nicaragua because of some volcanic activity or something like that. They were saying that there was a volcano that just had erupted, and there are all these, there's like 10, 12 active volcanoes in Nicaragua, and like, oh no, it's not going to work here. We can't do this here. It's mostly because Zelaya was saying that. So we got to move it down to what was Colombia, but then became Panama. And then we had the Panama Canal. So that was one reason why we were involved there. Another reason why that my colleague Graydon has talked about kind of U.S. ideology and kind of that time period and the manliness understanding of Teddy Roosevelt and being like, the United States hasn't been in a major war for a while. Like, we need to be spreading our wings as a, kind of a gendered understanding of like, going through our backyard, and like, we need to control the area. We need to be in more wars. We need to be more aggressive because that'll like make our country more, masculine. Why
don't those jungles have civilization is right. What Theodore Roosevelt was wondering is why are there not railroads going through Central America? And to challenge, and it is this contradiction of man challenging it, and then but volcano, we'll leave that be. And what's interesting too is we'll continue on this historical path. I think it's a good path. But what's interesting is seeing the parallels as these things continue, like seeing the Chinese businessmen still talking about potentially going through Nicaragua to challenge the Panama Canal, and engineer a new great canal across Nicaragua, which is probably not going to happen. But it's interesting to see how a lot of these things, you might be saying as a listener, but wait, that's in the 1880s, the early 1900s, Theodore Roosevelt, we're talking over 100 years ago. So how good of that is a comparison to what's happening now? But a lot of the things that are happening seem to continue. So what else? We have the manliness, we have the human. What other things does the Central America have that we like in the U.S.? Oh,
well, kind of what you were getting into is another ideological point is achening back to the Monroe Doctrine, which is kind of saying to the European powers who had controlled South America and Central America to that point, most of the British, that this region is now part of our sphere of influence. They don't really get economic control until about the turn of the 20th century, with their military power increasing, especially their naval power. But it was a proclamation to say that it wasn't just a realpolitik type of understanding of like, this is our space. It's also saying that these are our people. Mm-hmm. These are the people that we need to care for and that we understand. And that we need that they understand, meaning Central Americans, South Americans, because of their level of underdevelopment and their irrationality in the economy and things like that. We need to teach them through different endeavors and through different projects, economic and otherwise, that the right way of doing, the American way of doing things, which is usually allowing free markets, rational thinking in terms of economics, liberal democracy, things of that nature.
Protestantism versus Catholicism,
for example. Yeah, exactly. So I think that was also a big part of the early 20th century, was this idea of that, there's independence movements going on here. People are starting to act for themselves. We need to make sure that they act the right way. Mm-hmm. For their own sake.
Right, and they get into the free market, especially. This is also the time there's a lot of good commodities in Central America that are not available. In fact, as Hawaii wasn't a state, in the early 1900s, there were no U.S. states that could grow coffee, for example, which Americans love more than tea, which they typically threw into harbors by Massachusetts. So coffee was a commodity, and there's, of course, other ones like bananas. People go bananas over Central America, and we have it. Sorry, that was a bad one. But we have it with United Fruit goes into Guatemala, and they build railroads, and it changes the way the indigenous interact with the land. It's no more timber being taken off on the coast and being taken to the sea. It's now railroads are going up to the highlands to get the coffee out. So we have that as well. And so to take us through maybe a U.S. intervention, what does that look like? And we can use any Central American nation for this, really, because they parallel each other often.
Yeah, so again, to recommend a book and to make a plug for my advisor, Dr. Alan McPherson just put out a book called The Invaders. Mm-hmm. I think it was a couple of years ago, but he talks in detail about the occupation of Nicaragua in the 1920s and things like that, and before, as well as Haiti and others. But that's a big one. And with all of these interventions, starting in the 20th century, like I said before, the ideological, and my argument is big on this, and everyone thinks this, but I think the ideological understanding of interventionism in America kind of begins to grow outside of its continental expansion. And the first place it starts to do that, other than the Philippines, but I think a little different than the Philippines, is kind of like Central America, right there, and the Caribbean. And you see this in Nicaragua. The 20s, you see this with a lot of movements to try to, for example, the Augusto Sandino and his movement in Nicaragua in the late 20s, early 30s, to try to create a secular nationalist state, not a communist state. He was not a communist. He was an anti-imperialist. And saw the injustices done to mostly peasants and those working in factories and things like that, and saw the United States as the imperialist power that was doing that. And it kind of started this trend, really, with Sandino, that I would say kind of pushed into the Cold War period, that kind of anti-imperialist narrative that kind of transformed into this kind of anti-capitalist narrative. But the United States, when he rose to power, they wanted to occupy the area. They wanted to occupy because they felt that he would take over and turn the country essentially into its own independent state that would dictate economic treaties, that would dictate economics for all kinds of things. So
yeah, as the big economic brother to the north, you can't have this developing, fledgling Central American nations misbehaving and not working within your systems, because it is pretty true to the imperial system where taking from the colonies. Very interesting. So the United States is deeply interwoven with Central America throughout the 19th century. And as we get into the Cold War, people start pushing back. You go back to Sandino. There's certainly other movements that are happening throughout Central America. How does this play into the migrations that are starting to happen?
Yeah, I mean, so again, you get into this level of control. That was a big part of this ideological understanding that we need to make sure we control the region in order to instill an Americanness in this region so that they can essentially become their own country, right? The self-determinationism of Wilsonian self-determinationism, that idea was still there, but there were all these stipulations for that. So when you get into the Cold War, you start getting into a more brutal kind of military interventionism. The Contra Wars in the 80s, but also the coup in Guatemala in the 50s. You get a lot of Civil War type violence that escalates. So before there was occupation, but the level of violence wasn't to the same scale, I would say, as it was during what was called the Cold War, but really was a hot war in places like Nicaragua, but also the regional. It was El Salvador. The whole region was built on this idea. So once you get into that period, that's when you start to see the ramifications of today in terms of the economic ramifications and destabilization, and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
And you also see a lot of migration. So
yes.
Cuba especially is a good example because you see the migrations of people who are anti-Spanish, but supportive of the United States. So not only are there people leaving the Central American nations who don't want to be there and coming to the United States through the 18th and early 19th century, but there's also people who are leaving and very fond of the United States and then learning and taking from the United States in order to go back and create a nation that can be sympathetic with the United States.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the leaders, like I was saying before, of kind of... So a good example of this is Cuba, but also in Nicaragua, which I've done a lot of study in, with the Sandinista movement that started in the 60s with Carlos Fonseca, and kind of was built on, Sandinista is built on this Augusto Sandino kind of understanding of anti-imperialism, turned into a Marxist-Leninist kind of anti-capitalist movement, took over the country in 79, but a lot of the people that fought against Somoza, the dictator there, that was backed by the United States for the last 40, 50 years, his family at least was the idea there, the coalition that took it over was not just Marxists. It was people that had studied in the United States, for example, people that enjoyed American culture, people that wanted to emulate the American system in terms of representative democracy. And you also had the left-wing guys that didn't want to do that necessarily, that had a different plan for how to reconstruct their society, right? But they had plans of reconstruction, meaning that this area had already been torn apart. They needed different modernization programs, okay? And the one that won out was the Sandinista one, right? And there's a lot of arguments as to why that happened, right? Yeah. But those that didn't win out in that even tried to work within the Sandinista government for the first couple of years, but then left when they saw that it was what they considered dictatorial, right? And totalitarian, was they ended up working in, the U.S. Department of State, or they ended up directing the Contras, or they ended up working in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, like Edgar Chamorro, who wrote a book called Packaging the Contras, which talks about his time as the head of the FDN, which was kind of the political arm of the Contras, right? The kind of the face of the Contras. And he worked for them for 3-4 years out of Tegucigalpa. And then he left them saying, this is crap, right? Like, this is not good. I don't see what's going on. And he goes and writes a book about kind of the whole kind of Reagan apparatus around that. But getting back to migration, you have that kind of migration definitely on the upper classes. Yeah,
but it's happening both in the upper classes and certainly from Mexico's point of view, while Mexico's undergoing civil war through the early part of the 20th century, people can actually just walk to the United States. There's no, at least until the 1920s, there's no sort of like, we don't want Mexicans here in the U.S. You know, people can come to the United States from Mexico. Certainly people fleeing war and the revolutions that are happening throughout Mexico. And someone who would walk through Mexico, say from Honduras or Guatemala, would likely experience the same thing.
Yeah, and I think, which we haven't really talked about too, is you can't really talk about migration out of Latin America without talking about drugs and the relationship between the United States and Latin America and drugs in the 80s, 90s, and up till today has been a huge part of that discussion. And Mexico is obviously a part of that. And the fleeing because of drug cartels and things like that has been politicized.
Yeah. So we have to get to drugs eventually.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Originally, and this is where my once an episode where I get to talk about China, the opium trade was just blowing up in the United States, and you know, it's the British Empire trading opium, but we associate opium with China, Chinatown. In San Francisco, Chinatown and opium dens were off the hook in the early 1900s, from what I hear. This is a reaction Theodore Roosevelt makes in 1907 with the Food and Drug Act. It's a response, yes, to the stuff you read about people putting in canned food in those northern factories, but it's also a response to drugs like opium that are being used in San Francisco, and America wants to say, no, that's not Americans using that. That's a Chinese drug. And this is sort of you're beginning to see the drawing of borders. Americans don't use opium. That's a China thing. Even though in San Francisco, you better believe Americans were using opium in the early 1900s. And I think we see parallels to this as well when we get to Central America. In the Cold War, though, we have a revolution in Cuba that seems to scare the United States and most of the world who's not communist. How does this translate to Central America and U.S. interventionism?
Okay, so in a couple ways, I would say it was definitely a watershed moment within the Cold War kind of Pan-American context, but also just the Cold War in general. You start seeing in documents from the State Department and the CIA the kind of exporting of revolution. Castroism is now being associated with all these other things, and we'll talk about it later. I have something about this later. But even to this day, the association with Fidel Castro and later Hugo Chavez is automatically in some places say, you know, this is a legitimate fear now. If they're talking about any kind of trade, any kind of understanding, or going to the same conference, now you're on the radar. If not on the radar, you are on the hit list, right? In terms of trying economic intervention, things like that, covert operations and stuff like that, just to make it becomes a new thing. Whereas before in Guatemala, before Castro came to power, it was, you know, more about just the concept of communism was still there, but the association of exporting revolution was not. It was more of a Soviet understanding. So I think it does change. And of course, the Sandinistas, Carlos Fonseca was trained in Cuba. There was a very strong connection there, opposed to other, you know, left-wing governments that were also associated with Castroism. He was actually really associated with Castroism, and it was true. There were a lot of military advisors that went to Nicaragua, supplies.
But the drug regimes don't emerge out of the communist nations, do they?
No, I mean, the government, the Reagan government, tried to associate the Sandinista revolution with drug regimes, and they tried to make that propaganda claim that drugs were coming through Nicaragua because the Nicaraguans wanted to dilute the American people, right? So they were facilitating this. The same with the Cubans, right? But yeah, for the most part, it's coming out of Colombia and Peru. Even though they both went through some sort of left-wing governments at some point in time, yeah, this is coming out of, you know, mostly Colombia and Peru in terms of the production of cocaine, production of other illicit drugs, things of that nature. So
let's talk a little bit then. Now we're towards the drug trade and this neoliberal connection of North America, really, with NAFTA and the quick paths between Mexico and the United States economically. How does that lead into Central America as well? Well, it is a big deal. I mean, the
the borders of Mexico and Central America are not the same understanding of what, especially back then, of the borders that we have today. So that whole, it's important to see that as a region, right? Where if you got drugs in Colombia and Peru that are being produced at the source and you need to transport them, if you're going to do it on foot, you have to do it through these countries, right? And in terms of NAFTA and in terms of neoliberalism, I think you start to see a combination of an increasing amount of economic insecurity with people in terms of not only their job but also their social security. Because a lot of these countries, especially Mexico, has a long history of social safety nets and things like that for its people since this revolution, although with intermittent problems with it. But neoliberalism, what that really does is it breaks down any kind of tariff systems, rule of law in terms of workspace violations, things like that. And this idea of free market ideologies perpetuates through this. Mm-hmm. And you end up with people that are desperate enough where they need to participate in either the drug industry, or they're just affected by it. I mean,
yeah. As I open this Coca-Cola, I'm gonna go on a little Coke. Talk about Coke a little bit, because Coca-Cola the Coca part of it was this secret recipe that had some cocaine that was coming from South America, coming through Central America. They've recently again been in the news because in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas, which borders with these Central American nations, Coca-Cola was polluting the rivers, and there was a rebellion. There's these Chiapas, the Marxist revolutionaries in Chiapas. So Coca-Cola, it's not just drugs. We're also talking about some of the things that Americans just love.
Well, yeah, I mean, to add to that, I wanted to talk about this before too, but just as the American products going into other countries is a form of kind of cultural interventionism in some ways, that you get ideas that go with products from one way to the other, from the United States finished products in the Western world to the Americas, right? So are what are portrayed as by the U.S. government as products coming from these places, which are what they consider only to be drugs, right? Yeah. So the drugs that are coming from these places south of our border are not just the drugs themselves, but they're an attempt at influencing our culture, influencing our way of life. They're imports of kind of a xenophobic nature, right? So they're getting these themes of xenophobia from the drug trade. The drug trade is not just about the war on drugs. It's about the war on these countries penetrating our borders to the point where we're losing a sense of who we are, right? Much like the Chinese during the Opium Wars. Yes. Right? So that, I feel like that's a big part. It's those
people that are associated with the drugs.
Brits that are in their uncivilized nature, right? That are bringing in this stuff and destroying our culture.
And I think that's really the operative word always of nationalism that we have to keep in mind is R, O-U-R, because where is that line drawn, and what is the culture, especially of a plurinational state like the United States that has people from all over the place? So at one time, Judaism was not our culture to most Americans, but then through years and years and years of Jews essentially conforming to American norms, changing traditions, that we can talk about the Christmasization of Hanukkah even, but Jews get to a point where they, Bernie Sanders is almost became president. Yeah. So it's kind of extraordinary, that word, how much it can change us and them, our. Who is our, and that sort of thing. And I see that certainly operating a lot with Central America. So as the drug wars go on, how does that impact Central America?
Well, you start seeing a larger rate of violence, for one thing. Just like any other cash crop, you start seeing a dependency factor in the economy. That was always kind of there in Central America, but less so in Mexico, and I think it started to change a lot more with NAFTA, where their cash crop becomes the transport of drugs. And if you don't believe that, you just have to look at the level of corruption in their political state with drug cartels and the power they have in controlling the regions that they have to understand the level of dependency that the Mexican official state has on the drug trade, right? So that is still there. That's really, I think, the big thing, because you look at the statistics, the amount of people that in, South and Central America that actually do drugs are way lower per capita than in the United States, right? But that's where all of these drugs are being produced, right? So it's very much like, Chiquita Banana in that sense, where you have, you go in and you say, no, don't diversify your crops, don't diversify your agriculture. You're going to produce this because it's the easiest and the cheapest. You go talk to a Peruvian farmer that's producing coca in Peru, and they're going to tell you the same thing a lot of times. Like, this is the cheapest and easiest thing for me to do to make the most money.
Yeah.
Are you going to blame that guy for doing that? No, because
he's trying to survive.
Yeah, before it was coffee, and now it's. So...
And this chain, the way these drugs and the way these commodities enter the United States and are sort of consumed in a senseless way. And, this is kind of where, I do this exercise with my students, and I urge them to just think. I'm like, please don't be sad about this, or don't, go home and be depressed. But I say, look at where your clothes are made. Most of our clothes now are made in Guatemala, El Salvador, countries in Central America. And the bananas we consume, still from there. The coffee we drink, still from there. And we don't even think about it. When we're drinking coffee, Starbucks might put the, very beautiful, they have the coolest art. I have a Jaguar sitting up here from Chiapas when they did a special blend. And it's just I bet most people just drank that and said, whatever, I just want the regular coffee.
Right.
So it's just I urge people to think about that a little, but it continues. And Central America's built up around this idea of, let's just go with what's working. And a lot of times, there are competitors that emerge and challenge the South American supremacy. Or Central American supremacy, especially coffee starts coming from Indonesia, things like that. And so it is about competition, it's about making money, and not everyone can benefit from that. So in Central America, we see the rise of these people who are controlling the drug trade. They get into government, and then what? So if you're someone who's outside of the drug trade and you're not making money in Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, what do you do?
That's a great question. Obviously people are doing other things than the drug trade in these countries, and there's things going on. It's not like it's all of that. But when you're talking about the people that are in these caravans, I would think it's impossible to separate that movement of people and the amount of people and the desperation of those people from the violence of the drug trade, but also kind of the roots of not, for the longest time, not being able to decide as a people who was going to be running their government, and being able to institute policies that bring a social safety net to their nations, to the point where they are represented in their nations. And that's really, I think, fundamentally the root of the problem that we've been talking about the last 45 minutes is Central Americans especially have yet to have a chance in a long time, if ever, to be able to have a government that represents the people, that produces policies that are for the benefit of Nicaraguans first, right?
So then what do you say then to people who are saying, well, okay, that sucks what the U.S. did. I don't like what the U.S. did. I think it was wrong. It's also the past, and I didn't do that. I'm just trying to make my way in America, and I don't have a social safety net. I can't go to the hospital. I don't have health care. So why do we take care of these people?
I would say that is a representation of the global issue of this problem, not just Central America. We talk about the history of it that goes way back, that has some relationship, not every relationship with the United States. There are local realities in these places that see these ideological understandings of the United States and the Soviet Union as a way to gain their own power, right? So this is not, and there's local understandings, we talk about the indigenous populations, all these different things factor into this. So it's not just U.S. interventionism that causes this. Look at Daniel Ortega right now, right? Mm-hmm. Part of the Sandinistas was espousing just what I was trying to say. That's what he was espousing, right? Mm-hmm. The other people were like, he seems kind of totalitarian. Ends up that he tried to just, dissolve everything that he tried to push for with Social Security just, like this year. So, but I think that is a really important point that this is starting to happen here. Like, people are freaking out. Like, I mean, that's when you look at the corruption in politics, because that's really been the big problem with Latin America. That's what people from the North have said about Latin America, which has been true, is that the fundamental problem with Latin America is the level of corruption in their governments. They're new governments, right? And therefore they don't have the systems of government like we did, that we created 200 something years ago, right? Mm-hmm. That has the stability to be able to transfer power and things like that. And now look at us and our own government, and we're starting to fall under that same understanding, and people are starting to get angry about the systemic issues of representative government, right? And the response becomes a totalitarian response, and usually a totalitarian, authoritarian kind of guy like Donald Trump. The way that they rally their political capital is through xenophobia, is through, castigating things like this Caravan and stuff like that, just like what's going on in Brazil, just like what's going on. Scapegoating,
which is an old tool of the authoritarian, is to say, when we can't point or find answers, or we have the answers and we don't want to say what they are, we point to someone else and say, well, it's actually these people's fault. But so let's talk about the Caravan again. Okay. Now, I've walked the Camino de Santiago. There's an excellent episode of Hour of History where I talk about it. 2 of them, actually, with Ali. And that's hard to walk very far. And these people are still south of Mexico City. I mean, there's a long walk. I mean, if we're talking, if thousands come to the U.S. border, this will be one of the more significant events in world history. To have walked from Honduras, not to mention the climate, the landscape, the violence, and made it to the that in itself would be significant. Right. But what happens once they get to the border?
Yeah, and that's what I was kind of talking to you about before this, which is kind of this is why I think this might be one of the biggest political events of the last 20 years, is because the way that this is being set up is that you have, if that does happen, where you get 5,000 super desperate people that have been through this long journey, right?
Enormous
super tired.
Journey.
So tired. And they're at the border, right? The question becomes, what does Donald Trump and his administration decide to do? What have we seen so far? So far, he's done this. He said that there's Muslim terrorists inside. He just recently said there's not. We don't have any proof of that. But the first thing he went to is Muslim terrorists inside, MS-13. Some of these people are evil. Some of these people are bad, right? And
I've heard diseases, contaminants.
I watched Fox News for a little bit to see what's going on that
we
side.
all do.
Yeah. The key word that was being used was, this is an invasion. This is an invasion, right? So this language is incredibly aggressive and violent. And he says we need to change laws. So what does he mean by that? He's saying that we need to send, which he did, send thousands of troops to the border. Some people can say this is just a political move to try to, build up for the elections that are coming. That may be true, but it also, it doesn't change the fact that there's 5,000 people that are going to be that could be at the border at one spot. Now the question really becomes, when they get to the border, what makes this fundamentally different, I think, although there isn't a lot of press coming out from inside about who's the leader of this. That's the big question. Who's the leader of this? Now, is it like kind of an Occupy kind of leaderless understanding where there's a general political consciousness? Are people like that? Are the mothers that are bringing their 3-year-old child and 2 children with them on this trip, is it just because they want to find a better place to live and to be able to survive, or is it also a political statement?
Well, we've seen the videos already. I think it was day 1 of the Caravan leaving, and it being called a Caravan, in which George Soros was accused of paying these people to migrate. On the way, I've told you before, I've read articles where they're showing an interview with a young child, and he's saying, I want to go to the USA so I can have my PlayStation back. And these kind of comments and these kind of, like, the video, we have no way of verifying. No one does. Historians don't. Journalists don't. I have seen very few journalists on the ground with this caravan.
There's a couple New York Times videos, but I really haven't seen, like, too much about interviewing people about their motivations as to...
So, like, how do we even come to terms with this in the age of, disinformation, where people are saying a lot, but we don't really know it's true. It's incredible.
Right. And, it's an interesting point. Like, in the age where we should be knowing so much about everything, we know very little about this in terms of the people in there and why, the motivations. That's always the question, like, why are they doing it? Is it because of these, like, materialist understandings of just wanting to make more money, right? Or is it out of, a necessity to live? Or is it out of a mixture of both? Or is it a political statement?
And the timing of it, right before the American elections, and the fact that these are now becoming it's basically becoming an election about immigration. The other day I was seeing a congressman from New Hampshire being asked, why are you talking about borders? You share a border with Canada, but there's not a lot of people coming from Quebec down into New Hampshire. So, and he said it's about America, and it's about being American and sticking by rules and this sort of thing. So I think we're going to have an enormous moment. Now, I wanted to clarify one thing. These people have said, or at least the news has said, that they're asylum seekers. So asylum seeking means that you are seeking a safe nation because you cannot live under the UN Declaration of Human Rights. You can't live with the guarantee of safety in any of the human rights, basically, because someone's trying to kill you.
Right.
Now, the tricky thing is once you get to the border and you say, I'm seeking asylum, the U.S. has a very complex... The U.S. does recognize asylum seekers, but you have to go through every step and prove that you're going to be killed.
Right.
Prove that your life is in danger.
Right, for whatever stipulation that you're discussing. Right, exactly.
And so President Trump has said these people have to go through legal ports of entry. That's what we call border ports. But obviously 7,000 will be hard to process. So it'd be interesting if Trump, instead of sending 15,000 soldiers, sent 15,000 bureaucrats to go sort through the documents.
Right. Yeah, that's like, why didn't he do that? Right, exactly. I mean, he could have done that. I guess, it becomes... So these are the options that he has, right? Either he does... So the one side of the story is the most passive he could be is trying to sort through every individual case that comes through, which could mean, based on the statistics on the percentage of people that are actually allowed to stay based on that asylum seeking status, he might end up having to imprison thousands of people
until their cases are worked out.
So how is he going to do that?
And he's saying like tent cities.
So,
So after walking across the length of Mexico, these people are going to have to live in tents for years, potentially.
Right. And this is assuming that they go to the port of entry. Again, I'm thinking, okay, it really does matter whether this is a political movement. Because if it is a political movement, wouldn't it make sense that what you're trying to do is to show the level of violence and corruption and inhumanity of the border system and the systems that are going on in Central America and the ties between the United States and that region, right? If that's the case, as a politically minded person that's trying to change things, not just material for yourself, I wouldn't just wait for it being processed. I'd just go with 3,000 other people across the river.
And this is where it gets to that critical moment of, and we saw it with the fall of the Berlin Wall, when East Germany had not been dissolved, and East Germans just, they were fleeing across German lines, and the East German soldiers had an option. Either we shoot these people for breaking the law, or our country falls apart and they leave.
Right.
Now, there's a potential that the American soldiers will also fail, or at least come up to this task of either we shoot these unarmed innocent people, or we're disobeying. What do you do if you disobey orders in the military, right? Right. So a huge momentous moment. Before we get to our suggestions, is there anything else that you wanted to mention in this? The hour of history goes so fast when we talk about pertinent issues. Is there anything about the migrant caravan or Central America that you had wanted to mention before?
Yeah, I have a little bit here on the 2009 coup in Honduras and during the Obama administration, because I think it does kind of relate to this, and the assassination of Berta Cáceres.
So you're gonna have to give us a lot of background.
Okay, so really quickly, President Zelaya was elected, I think it was in 2008, who was kind of a progressive candidate in Honduras. And he was associated with being friends, quote unquote, with the Cubans and the Venezuelans. Because of that, he, in an interview, said later that his coup and his forcible removal, was a conspiracy by right-wing U.S. politicians, one of which, Otto Reich, who happened to be the head of the Reagan propaganda program during the Contra War, to convince Congress to send $100 million to support the Contras. I've interviewed the man, Otto Reich. Used to be the former ambassador to Venezuela before Hugo Chavez, right? And I've interviewed the guy, and from what I've understood from that interview, I wouldn't put it past them to be doing this, considering the history of this, right?
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton's press conference talking about this, she was asked about this in 2016. When she was running for president, and she was asked about the 2009 coup, quote unquote, and she said that I wouldn't consider it a coup because by law, what happened was Zelaya called for a referendum to change the Constitution, which was the Constitution that went a long way back that he felt needed to be changed, right? The referendum was non-binding. Okay, so it was just to get a poll of the people whether they want to have a constitutional assembly.
Yes.
When he did that, that was triggered in the legal system, which says that you cannot change the Constitution without going through the congressional state. And they saw that referendum as a breach of that, and therefore they had the coup, right?
Yeah.
They removed him from power. So Clinton acknowledged that there was an understanding with the United States about this, and they were in agreement with his removal based on legality of it, right? She didn't agree with how it happened, which was storming into his house in his pajamas and taking him out, right? With his family, pulling his daughter by the hair and all that kind of stuff. It's all filmed. And, so what I'm trying to get at here is she said that saved a civil war.
Whoa.
That he could have gone to Nicaragua, she said, and he had friends in Nicaragua, right? And if he didn't do that, right? We didn't do that, it might have started a civil war, right? Which is the same kind of trope that happened with Allende in the 70s, the same kind of trope all the way through, which is these people are not capable of running the country themselves because they start civil wars, they do all these different things, right? And then since 2009, that coup, you've had a massive uptick in killings and all of these things, making it one of the most dangerous places on the planet.
Not to mention the continuous deportations of...
Yes.
Those who have come to the United States and have been found without documents are sent back to this crazy...
large portion of those migrants are from Honduras. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that.
It's very and it's very recent history, very important to talk about. So wow. The migrant caravan marches on. Today we have our suggestions. I'll go first.
Okay.
This is the third day, the final day of Dia de los Muertos in Mexico and Central America. And so I'm going to suggest the best movie of all time.
Yeah.
Coco.
Oh.
No, I'm just kidding. It's not the best movie of all time, but it is a fantastic movie. It's pretty good. And Netflix didn't take it off for November. That would have been a really lame move. But, Coco, go watch it.
Okay, well, I'm going to have another movie suggestion.
Oh.
So I suggest 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, which is a movie with actress Frances McDormand and the Coen brothers, I believe. And the reason I say that is because I was going on a date with someone, and we wanted to go see Coco, but in the beginning of the movie, there was like an opening thing with Frozen. I had never seen Frozen before, so I didn't know. I thought this was like, it was so bad. It was like this weird, like, I don't know what it was. It wasn't the movie, but it was like and there was like a baby crying. I was like, I need to get out of here. Yep. I needed to get out of here.
I've been there.
And we went to go see that other movie, which was good, but I still need to see Coco. So
wow. Two great movie suggestions. Yes. All the books that were mentioned in this podcast will be up at www.hourofhistory.com/Rex, RECS. So all of those books that we've mentioned through the podcast, as well as the movies, are going to be at hourofhistory.com/Rex. Well, Josh, it's been a pleasure. I think we'll all be watching this migrant caravan with a close eye, as well as the words that are being used to describe it coming up to the election. We should indeed. So thanks again, listeners, for listening to Hour of History. Please do subscribe, leave your comments and feedback, and don't be afraid to visit hourofhistory.com/Rex, RECS. Happy Dia de los Muertos. I don't know if it's a happy sort of greeting, but enjoy. And thanks for listening on Hour of History, where it's our world, anytime, any place. See ya.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/Rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast, as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.